Welcome to this week's edition of First United Methodist Church Sunday School. We're glad to see you whatever time you're watching this, and we want to thank you for giving your time to us. This morning we're continuing our discussion about reckless love, and we're going to start talking about valuing the vulnerable. So the quote I have for you today is from Booker T. Washington. He said, "I think I began learning that those who are happiest are those who do the most for others. This lesson I have tried to carry with me ever since." And so I want to begin today by telling you a story. This past week, my partner and I were invited out to the home of a lawyer in the area. We're going to call him Ted, even though that's not his real name, to see what we could do to give him a price to sell his home. We drove up on 10 acres of beautiful land and a huge 3-story house setting back from the road. But instead of landscaping, we saw several old cars sitting around. One needed a tire, one needed an engine. So the door opened and out came no less than 5 dogs of different varieties, none purebred, to greet us, and one older gentleman. As we approached the house, in our mind, all we could think about is, this is going to be hard to show. So we walk on up to the house. He invites us in. There are children walking around. There's people in the living room, people in the kitchen. We didn't really know what was going on. So he took us on the tour of his house. He had a huge home with 5 regular bedrooms, as well as a full basement and several bathrooms, all of which were just cluttered with living items, clothing, toys. It wasn't dirty, it was just filled. One room was a little girl's room filled with Barbie houses and things. One room was a little boy's room with a little boy in it and his pet dragon. I think they call him, it's one of those dragons that has kind of a collar. I can't think of what it was called now because I was a little startled to see it in there. But at any rate, as we walked through the house, totally, this man didn't live alone. He lived with a lot of people. So he took us back to his office, which looked exactly like a law office, had all of his books up there and everything, and sat down, and we said, "So tell us about what's happening in the house." And he began this story. He said, "For years I worked with people who were drug addicted." He said, "I took them to court. I tried cases against them." He said, "About 5 years ago, I won a very large case that enabled me to buy this home." And he said, "I really hadn't intended to take people in, but God put this in front of me, and I decided to do it." Come to find out, he had this one family, started out with a mother, a father, 3 children, and a mother-in-law, with him for 5 years. He said, "What I've learned is you have to get people in a rehab program, but you have to take them away from their friends who are also users. So by moving them into my home, I could do this." And we were so amazed because we were all thinking as we went out there, not about learning a story about someone who valued the vulnerable and loved and cared for them and provided a place for them, but we were thinking, how do we value this real estate? Very different from valuing people. So as we went on and talked to Ted a little bit more, he told us that the one family was back on their feet. They've put a deposit down on buying a house and should be moving out at the end of the month. What a wonderful story. But over those 5 years, imagine the ups and downs he experienced with them. In addition to those folks, he has 3 others living with him, so about a total of 10, which he gave us a rough count on that. But now he's older and he's thinking of downsizing, so he's thinking about what he could do when these folks move into their home. But I'm thinking about where they would be if they hadn't met him. So as we think about that, let's think about where some of the vulnerable would be if they hadn't met Jesus. Jesus goes looking for people to help, and he doesn't go looking where people don't need help. He goes out into places where he would find people. He meets a man in a synagogue with a paralyzed hand. Now, the Pharisees are all up in that because they think it's Sabbath, and if Jesus heals this man, he will have broken the law. They watch him closely, and of course, They're hoping he will, not because they want the man's hand to be better, but so they can bring him up for charges for working on the Sabbath. And it was the same in social situations with Jesus. A woman enters a dinner Jesus is attending at the home of a Pharisee and washes Jesus' feet with her tears and her hair. And they are incredulous that he didn't just kick her out right then. This man was a prophet. He would have known that she was the kind of woman who shouldn't be touching him. She is a sinner. That's how we think sometimes. The root of all that conflict is the simple question, who's in and who's out? If people in drug rehab are out, we don't have to love them. For the Pharisees, the scribes, and the Sadducees, they assumed they were in. By in, I mean they felt they had lived within the will of God. They believed they were in because they deserved to be. They were fervent in keeping God's law. They studied and learned and tried to employ even the smallest rules and guidelines in the Mosaic law. And because they knew the law so well and outwardly fulfilled its requirements, they were quick to know when everyone else was not fulfilling the law. They judged others accordingly. They became frustrated that others didn't keep the law as they did. And this is a pitfall common among religious people. Those who are most committed, if they're not careful, become self-righteous and begin to think that they should control the doors that determine who's in and who's out. It's especially true if you think you're in, not because of God's love and grace, but because you've made right decisions and you've taken your commitments seriously. So who is in and who's out? One of the easiest ways to make the commandment to love God and our neighbor manageable is to identify large groups of people who are definitely out. If we can reduce the number of people to whom this commandment applies, it gets easier. Once we decide that some people are unworthy of our love or attention, we can safely place them far beyond the pull of our orbit so that we don't see them, we don't have to think about them. We no longer have to figure out how to love them if we judge them not worthy of our love to begin with. But all the time Jesus walked this earth, he tried to teach his disciples through his actions, through his words, and through his life that we are here to love all people, not to decide who's in and who's out. I go back to my new friend Ted, who didn't decide that these people were out because they were unlovable, because they were drug users, but he brought them into his home. He allowed them to divide up his huge basement into 3 more bedrooms and a sitting area so that these families could have a space of their own while they're there with him. I'm so amazed at his ability to give up everything but his master suite and his law office and to give his whole house to them, providing food for them, providing shelter for them, and many of the basic needs people have to get back on their feet. Like Ted, Jesus' love was free of categories and distinctions of who was more or less deserving. We hear stories of this throughout his life. He wanted everyone to be in the circle of his love. He was willing to ruin his reputation with the Sadducees, the Pharisees, and the scribes to be with the people who needed him most. Jesus said he came to seek and save those that were lost, not those who were already saved. When you allow yourself to love the vulnerable, you are taking yourself to people and places you would never choose to meet, and probably uncomfortable situations. That must be how the disciples felt as they stood near Jesus and spent time with people the Gospels called sinners. Often we're not even sure what sins they've committed, but based on the comments of religious leaders who complained to Jesus, they knew they were tax collectors, prostitutes, drunkards, gluttons, among other things. But rather than avoid those people, he came in and had meals with them. If you remember, he saw them not as bad people who needed judged, but as lost people who needed to be steered back to God. He did not encourage poor morals or enable bad habits. Love is found in truth-telling and difficult conversations. So think about this. When Jesus met these people and healed these people, he often said, "Go." When he met the woman at the well who had had 7 husbands, he said, "Go and sin no more." When he healed the man who was by the pool of water who laid there, he thought perhaps that man had wanted to be there and gotten used to just being there as a beggar. He said, "You get up and go." and wash your hands, take up your bed and walk. And he left that situation knowing he had a job to go to. He had something to inspire him. When he encountered the man named Legion, who was probably by our standards a mentally ill man, but in those days people who acted irrationally were called demon possessed. So he lived in a cemetery up on top of the hill, and all the townspeople were freaked out by him, and he would scream and cry out and all of these things. Well, Jesus went up on that hill, and the man came running toward him. And Jesus said, "What's your name?" And he said, "My name is Legion, for we are many." And so, as we all know, Jesus cast the demons out of this man and sent them into a herd of swine, which then ran into the water of the Sea of Galilee. So, off a cliff, we're told. So then Legion was so amazed to have his life back, he sat down and talked with Jesus, and he wanted to follow Jesus and leave. And Jesus said, "No, you go back to your town where your people are and tell them what was done for you." Like the man Legion, there were people who received Jesus' attention who were forced to live as outcasts. And these were people who were sick, emotionally ill, had leprosy, and we've all heard the stories of how people became sick in this society and were considered cursed by those who weren't sick. So they had to go off and live away from their families, placed apart in villages. But Jesus went to them and talked to them. Today, you may see a woman in town pushing a shopping cart with her few possessions down a city street, muttering to herself. The impact is the same, no matter what the condition described. People tend to move away from such people, not toward them. Except Jesus. He encounters them not as people who are unsafe, but as people who are unseen. He also spent time with the Gentiles. If you'll remember, he healed a man at the request of a Roman centurion and said to the Roman centurion, "You are a man of great faith." Gentiles were either immigrants to the country or they were members of the occupying army of the Roman Empire. So they were not loved by those who followed God's law in the days when Jesus walked the earth. Many times that's a case for us. There are people here who don't look like us or act like us or have the same values as we do. And it's very easy for us to look down upon them instead of bringing them in and loving and caring for them. Finally, Jesus spoke good news to the poor. At a time when religious people often assumed that poverty was another sign of God's curse on your life, people didn't think about whether your parents were literate or you had access to education, never mind that you couldn't choose whether you were born in a mansion or a shack. They simply assumed that because you were poor, it was a sign you had sinned and God was punishing you and withholding a blessing. While the religious leaders often argued with Jesus about his interaction with people in these groups, he never failed to talk to them and attend to them. His disciples must have thought it very odd when Jesus gave his time and energy to such people. A famous rabbi typically only mingled with the wise and the literate and the wealthy, but Jesus spent time with the least, the last, and the lost. I love to think about that because it reminds me that we can so easily reside in a little circle of friends and our people who are just like us, not allowing ourselves to think outside of our own comfort level. I struggle with that problem of not judging others and trying to do my best to reach out to others outside my circle. I want to be more like Ted. I might not be able to open my home and take the risks that he did, but he decided it didn't matter how beautiful his home was, how everything was perfectly in place. It mattered that these people had a safe place to get on the road to recovery. I would like to love people enough to go to extraordinary measures, to open doors and invite them in. I don't know if I'll ever be as strong as Ted, but I hope that his example to me this past week helps me to change my life. And remember that Jesus encouraged us to be door openers rather than gatekeepers. That he hoped that once people experienced the goodness of God, the love of God, and the grace of God, they would reside in it and be free to share it with others. This is why people who are sinners, outcast, and poor loved Jesus so much and felt such joy and tried to be in his presence. He accepted them for who they were. Something powerful happens to our faith when we attend to God's commandment to love others. especially those who do not have relationships, position, or wealth. I think about this, and as my friend and I drove back home from that meeting, we talked all the way about what an amazing thing it was Ted was doing, how it would be difficult to sell his house until he was able to get fewer people, fewer dogs, and fewer cats living there. But he's adjusted, and every evening all the members of that household, regardless of how diverse they are, come together and prepare a meal and sit down together at a dining room table and fellowship. And this is a lesson to us. You know, sometimes we don't see that homeless people exist in our town. It's very difficult to be able to get through drug rehab and get the money together to rent a property. You have to have a credit report. You have to have 1 month's rent. It isn't easy to get back on your feet without a place like what Ted was providing, so that you could get a job first, take care of your basic needs first, and then step forward. It's an amazing thing, and I will keep this in my memory for a really long time. I think about the fact that people who are homeless and people who are lost and people who are drug addicted have families, they have feelings, they have hopes and dreams, they have worries, and maybe they're totally disconnected from their families because their family is struggling with putting up with them and their behaviors. But Jesus has a way of seeing people beyond their issues and giving them a second chance. We may not be miracle workers, but through this same love of Christ, we can work to disrupt what holds people down. When you think about that, you may have friends who have a child with mental illness. You may have friends who have a child with Down syndrome, and you may need to think about Jesus redeeming people regardless of what others said and regardless of how others judged them. I think about Jesus' short time on life and how much he accomplished and how curious he was to meet and to know others. An easy way to love others is to start by listening to them. Ask them questions. Don't rush in with solutions or advice or offer up your latest big idea. Be inquisitive and attend to the people. And remember, Rome wasn't built in a day, and trust isn't built in a minute. Just because you want to reach out to these people, they may have had experiences where others reached out to them and then abandoned them or didn't give them the opportunity to get back on their feet. If you want to love vulnerable people, you have to take a risk of engaging people in situations that are different from the ones you know and are expected. The disciples followed Jesus and heard him say they would be blessed. He said, "You will be blessed if you care for the sick and feed the hungry." Then they saw him do these things. He touched the lepers. He fed the crowds. He stopped near the woman to hear the woman talk about her disease. They saw Jesus was engaged, and they realized they would have to be too if they wanted to become like their teacher. It's still appropriate to have expectations. It's still appropriate to expect that the best way to be kind is to avoid being mean, to think about people and have expectations, but you also have to realize they may miss that bat. They may miss that goal you set for them, so you have to be patient. I imagine over the 5 years this family had been with Ted, and they grew from 3 children to 4, that his expectations were dashed, but yet he still loved them, cared for them, and allowed them to stay. He walked beside them and communicated with them. So moments when we are unloving don't require negative emotions or anger or revenge. They often happen in the normal course of our work and our life. That's why it's so important to have the rule of Christ's love in your life that leads to acts of kindness and makes words and actions of contempt feel unnatural and out of place. When you think about the very little that we can do on this earth to share God's love, when we love the vulnerable, whether it's by donating money to our homeless shelter, whether it's by asking our leaders in our city, what is your plan to take care of the homeless problem we have? Where can we find places for people to stay who are homeless, where they can get back on their feet? How can we help the drug addicted? Do we have a rehab program here? When you learn these things and you also reach out to help people who've come here who have a language barrier, you are doing the work that Jesus asked us to do as his church and his followers. Thank you for your time this morning, and I hope you have a blessed day.